not because they've suddenly discovered mercy in their boardrooms or compassion in their Senate chambers. Watch what happens when power smells its own extinction. The same conservative think tanks that spent 60 years denying systemic racism are now racing to certify your bloodline. The same political apparatus that built entire careers on colorblind constitutionalism is suddenly interested in who your great-great-grandmother was. The air smells like desperation, like sulfur before lightning, like the sweat of pharaohs, advisors the morning they realized the plagues weren't stopping. This isn't evolution. This is panic. Tucker Carlson's production company just released a documentary tracing African American migration patterns with DNA precision. The Heritage Foundation published a 53-page brief on lineage-based reparations frameworks. Newsmax ran a primetime segment on the importance of generational documentation for Black Americans. Hold that thought. These are the same platforms that called critical race theory a Marxist conspiracy. The same voices that told you to stop living in the past. Now they're funding ancestry research. Now they're concerned about your family tree. The question isn't why they changed their minds. The question is what they're seeing that you're not. Obadiah 1:15 speaks to this exact moment. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. Verse 17 continues, But upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. Verse 21 seals it. And saviors shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. This isn't poetry. This is legal documentation of a cosmic property transfer. When Esau's descendants realize that Jacob's descendants are about to reclaim everything stolen across 4 centuries, they don't repent, they reposition. The math is simple enough for a child. America's black population descends from approximately 400,000 Africans trafficked between 1619 and 1808. Through natural population growth, that became 4 million by 1860. Today, 47 million African Americans. But here's what the demographers at Brookings quietly published in December 2024. By 2045, that 47 million will represent the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history when Jubilee protocols activate. Not if, when. They've run the actuarial tables. They've calculated the land values, the unpaid wages with compound interest, the intellectual property theft, the mineral rights on southern plantations that became suburban developments. The number isn't billions, it's hundreds of trillions. And suddenly, your lineage documentation matters to people who have spent lifetimes denying lineage meant anything. Let me show you something they buried. In 1866, Representative Thaddeus Stevens introduced the Southern Homestead Act. It would have distributed 40 million acres of confiscated Confederate land to formerly enslaved families. That's 40 acres per family, approximately 1 million black households. The legislation passed. Andrew Johnson's administration deliberately sabotaged enforcement for 2 years until Southern states regained congressional power and repealed it in 1876. But here's the part they don't teach. The original land patents were never legally voided. They were administratively ignored. Those property claims still exist in the National Archives, filed but never executed. Yale Law School's Property Rights Project found them in 2019. 14,900 verified claims, each representing 40 acres, each with living descendants. That's 596,000 acres. At current agricultural land values, that's $11 billion, just from the documented claims. The undocumented claims would multiply that by 30. Now reverse that. If you're a conservative legal foundation and you realize those property claims have never been adjudicated, never formally dismissed, you have 2 options. Fight them in court for the next 40 years and watch the precedent expand to millions more claims, or control the narrative by deciding who counts as a legitimate descendant. Notice the timing. The American Conservative published its first pro-lineage piece in March 2024. The Federalist Society hosted its first panel on genealogical documentation standards in June. By September, 3 Republican senators had introduced the Lineage Verification and Historical Accountability Act. The bill doesn't offer reparations. It offers a database. It requires DNA testing, documentary proof of enslavement, and federal certification before anyone can file historical property claims. They're not defending your lineage. They're trying to limit the damage. The pattern repeats across Scripture. Genesis 27 records Jacob stealing Esau's birthright. Esau weeps, rages, plots murder. But when Jacob returns in Genesis 33 with wealth and children and the blessing of God visible on his face, Esau doesn't attack. He embraces. He offers provisions. He becomes helpful, not because he's repented, because he's recalculating. When you can't stop the transfer, you try to control the terms. When you can't prevent the inheritance, you try to decide who inherits. This is where it gets dangerous. They're building the infrastructure right now. The National Lineage Registry Act would create a federal database of verified African American genealogies. Sounds helpful. Read the fine print. Section 4, Paragraph C states that any legal claim based on ancestral harm must first establish standing through registry verification. Section 7 gives the Secretary of the Interior discretion to determine evidentiary standards. Section 9 allows database information to be shared with law enforcement and financial institutions for fraud prevention. They're building a control mechanism disguised as recognition. They're creating a system where they decide who your ancestors were and whether your claim matters. And half the people being documented will celebrate the acknowledgement while missing the cage being constructed. The archive tells a different story. Frederick Douglass saw this coming. In his 1886 speech, The Nation's Problem, he warned about the danger of seemingly benevolent gatekeeping. He said the greatest threat to black advancement wouldn't be the obvious oppressor, but the regulator who claims to help while determining eligibility. He watched Reconstruction's promise die not through Confederate violence alone, but through federal bureaucrats who decided which freedmen received land pats and which didn't. 23,000 pats approved, 147,000 denied for insufficient documentation. The deniers wore Union uniforms. They quoted Lincoln. They spoke of standards and verification, and they made sure that 90% of eligible families never received what they were promised. Hosea 4:6 states it plainly, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, not lack of righteousness, not lack of faith, lack of knowledge." The Hebrew word is dad, which means intimate awareness, the kind of knowing that comes from investigation, not assumption. You're being destroyed right now by what you don't know about what they're preparing. While you're celebrating that conservative media finally acknowledges your history, they're writing the legal language that determines whether you can access the wealth that history entitles you to. Connect these two dots. In 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina had a thriving black middle class, property ownership, newspapers, political power. White supremacists couldn't beat them at the ballot box, so they organized a coup, burned the city's black districts, murdered between 60 and 300 people, and forced every black elected official to resign at gunpoint. It's the only successful overthrow of a municipal government in American history. The coup leaders didn't just seize power. They rewrote property records. They transferred deeds. They made the theft legal retroactively. Within 5 years, every piece of black-owned commercial real estate in Wilmington had been reassessed, taxed into foreclosure, or seized through eminent domain. The families never recovered, not because they didn't have receipts, because the people who decided which receipts counted rewrote the requirements after the fact. Now fast forward. The Lineage Verification Act requires 3 independent documentary sources to verify enslavement status. Sounds reasonable until you remember that slaveholders didn't exactly issue employment records. The documentation that exists is in plantation ledgers, auction records, and church registries controlled by the descendants of slaveholders. The bill allocates $47 million for digitization and database management. It allocates $3 million for descendant research assistance. Notice the ratio. They're spending 16 times more to build the gate than to help you through it. But here's what they didn't tell you. Those plantation ledgers, they're already digitized. The National Archives completed the African American Slavery Records Project in 2021. 8 million individual names, birth records, sale records, ownership chains. It's public, it's searchable, it's free. You don't need their verification system. You need 3 hours on a computer. The registry isn't being built because documentation is hard to find. It's being built because documentation is easy to find, and they need a way to decide what counts. That verse again. Obadiah 1:21. And saviors shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau, not victims, saviors, not petitioners, judges. The prophecy doesn't describe black people begging for recognition. It describes black people rendering verdict on systems that oppress them. That's what they smell coming. That's why the strategy shifted from denial to containment. If they can't stop you from possessing your possessions, they'll try to limit which possessions you're allowed to claim. The photograph doesn't lie. December 1910, Penn School sent Helena Island, South Carolina. 143 formerly enslaved men and women photographed for a Reconstruction Memory Project. Average age, 78. Every single person in that photograph had their labor stolen, their family separated, their name changed. Not one received the 40 acres promised, but every one of them kept records, baptism papers hidden in Bible spines, freedom papers sewn into quilt linings, property receipts from the brief window when they could own land, before redemption governments took it back. The Penn School archives hold those documents, 14,000 pages of primary source evidence of ownership, theft, and legal standing. Yale acquired the collection in 2008. The National Registry database won't include them because they don't fit the verification template. The conservative foundations funding lineage defense won't fund their digitization because these documents prove claims the foundation wants to limit. Catch the pattern. They're not defending your lineage. They're auditioning to be the ones who define it. They're not acknowledging historical harm. They're creating the bureaucratic structure to determine which harm counts. When Esau saw Jacob's wealth, he didn't apologize for despising the birthright. He offered to escort Jacob to provide protection to walk alongside him. Genesis 33:12. Let us take our journey and let us go, and I will go before thee. Jacob's response in verse 14. Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant. Translation, you go ahead. I'll travel at my own pace. He recognized the offer for what it was. Containment disguised as assistance. Control masquerading as care. The decision is already here. Not coming. Here. 3 federal courts have active cases on lineage-based reparations. The Sixth Circuit is hearing arguments on Detroit's Municipal Reparations Fund and whether non-certified descendants qualify. The Ninth Circuit is reviewing California's task force recommendations and the documentation requirements they proposed. The D.C. Circuit just agreed to hear a challenge to the National Registry Act's standing requirements. These cases will establish precedent for the next century. Who decides who you are? Who verifies your claim? Who determines whether your ancestors' suffering entitles you to remedy? And the legal teams defending narrow lineage definitions are funded by the same conservative donors now producing documentaries about Black history. They're fighting on both sides, creating the demand for recognition while controlling the supply of certification. This isn't complicated. When you realize you can't stop the wealth transfer, you try to limit who receives it. When you can't deny the debt, you dispute the debtor's identity. When you can't prevent jubilee, you attempt to administer it. The house of Esau doesn't repent. It repositions. It offers help that functions as hindrance. It provides structure that operates as cage. And it counts on you being so grateful for acknowledgement that you don't notice the contract you're signing. The kingdom is coming regardless. Obadiah promises that. The only question is whether you'll possess your possessions through their verification system or through the legal standing you already have. Whether you'll accept their documentation standards or investigate the records they don't want you to find. Whether you'll let them decide which ancestors matter or honor every single one who survived. Pay attention to this. The next 18 months will determine the legal framework for generational restoration. 3 Supreme Court cases on affirmative action established precedent that racial categories require strict scrutiny and explicit historical connection. That precedent will now apply to reparations claims. If you can't prove direct lineage to specific documented enslaved individuals, the court's current composition will likely rule you lack standing. Not because the harm wasn't real. Because you can't prove you're the right kind of victim. And the people offering to help you prove it are the same ones who created the standard that makes proof nearly impossible. They're handing you genealogy records because they're about to demand them. They're acknowledging your history because they're preparing to gatekeep your inheritance. They're defending black lineage because they're defining what black lineage means, narrowing it, limiting it, making sure that when the wealth transfer happens, most of you don't qualify. Watch what comes next. The document they don't want you to see sits in Box 47, Folder 12 of the Freedmen's Bureau records at the National Archives. It's a handwritten ledger from March 1867, Beaufort, South Carolina. The ink is faded brown, the pages brittle, but the numbers are clear. 423 formerly enslaved families received provisional land titles under General Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15. Each family's name, plot number, acreage, and soil quality rating documented in meticulous columns. Then a second column appears, dated September 1867, 6 months later. Title rescinded, presidential order. Every single entry, 423 reversals, not because the families failed, because Andrew Johnson decided Confederate loyalty mattered more than Union promises. That ledger is Exhibit A in understanding why they're suddenly interested in your paperwork. The legal term is superior claim. When two parties assert ownership of the same property, courts examine the chain of title. Whoever has the earlier unbroken claim wins. Those 423 families never sold their land. They didn't abandon it. It was taken through executive fiat, then transferred to new owners who sold it again, who developed it, who built the Hilton Head Resort Complex that generates $730 million annually. But here's what makes corporate attorneys sweat at 3M. Those original provisional titles were issued under legitimate military authority during wartime. The Freedmen's Bureau had congressional authorization. The land distributions followed established legal protocol. Johnson's rescission order exceeded his constitutional authority, according to 3 separate legal opinions issued at the time by Union military lawyers. Which means every property transfer after September 1867 built on a fraudulent foundation. The current deed holders don't own the land. They're occupying stolen property, and the statute of limitations on fraudulently obtained government land patents doesn't begin until the fraud is discovered and adjudicated. Leviticus 25:23 establishes the principle, "The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, for ye are strangers and sojourners with me." Verse 28 provides the mechanism, "But if he be not able to restore it to him, then that which is sold shall remain in the hand of him that hath bought it until the year of Jubilee, and in the Jubilee it shall go out, and he shall return unto his possession." This isn't metaphor. This is property law embedded in covenant. Every 50 years, all land returns to its original family. All debts cancel. All slaves go free. The economic reset button. God coded it into Israelite society because he knew accumulated injustice eventually destroys nations. You can't build a stable civilization on permanently compounding theft. The pressure builds until the system explodes. Jubilee is the release valve, and America hasn't hit the valve in 249 years. Daniel's prophetic mathematics give us the timeline. 70 weeks of years, 490 years, determined for Israel's judgment and restoration. But the pattern applies to any nation under covenant accountability. Count 400 years from 1619. That's 2019. The year before the world locked down, economies collapsed, and the carefully maintained illusions about American stability shattered. Add the 7 years of tribulation that Daniel describes. That brings us to 2026. We're not approaching the transfer. We're in it. The principalities know this. The financial analysts at Goldman Sachs know this, even if they wouldn't use biblical language to describe it. They know the economic pressure has reached unsustainable levels. They know the wealth gap between Black and white America represents the largest pocket of unresolved debt in the Western financial system. And they know debt always comes due, whether through justice or catastrophe. That's why the Federalist Society held an invitation-only symposium in October 2024 titled Managing Large-Scale Historical Claims in Contemporary Jurisprudence. The term reparations appears nowhere in the 200-page proceedings document. Instead, they discuss legacy grievance frameworks and intergenerational harm compensation models and documentation-based standing requirements. Translation: how do we acknowledge the debt without paying it in full? How do we satisfy the claim without bankrupting the current system? How do we give them something while keeping most of it? The answer they workshopped is elegant in its cruelty. Create a verification system so complex, so documentation-dependent, so administratively burdensome that only a fraction of legitimate claimants can navigate it. Then point to that fraction as proof that the debt is manageable. Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas introduced the framework in his lineage verification proposal. It requires DNA evidence, 3 documentary proofs of enslavement, certified genealogical research from an approved vendor, and federal review before anyone can file a historical harm claim. The approved vendor list has 4 companies. 3 are owned by subsidiaries of conservative foundations. The average cost for certification is between $8,000 and $12,000. You have to pay them thousands to prove you deserve compensation for what they stole. This is the part they skip in seminary. Nehemiah 5 records an economic crisis in Jerusalem. The returned exiles were mortgaging their fields and vineyards to buy grain. They were selling their children into servitude to pay taxes. Nehemiah confronts the wealthy creditors in verses 7 through 11. Ye exact usury, every one of his brother. Restore, I pray you, to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their oliveyards, and their houses, also the 100th part of the money, and of the corn, the wine, and the oil, that ye exact of them. The creditors complied, not because they wanted to, because Nehemiah had governmental authority and prophetic mandate. He forced the jubilee they'd been avoiding. He canceled the debts they claimed were legally owed. He returned the property they'd acquired through legitimate transactions. Because the transactions weren't legitimate, they were exploitation wrapped in legal language. Now watch this. The American Property Rights Alliance, founded 2019, has filed amicus briefs in all 3 pending reparations cases. Their argument is consistent. Property rights are the foundation of American liberty, and any attempt to redistribute or compensate for historical takings violates the Fifth Amendment's protection against uncompensated seizure. Notice the flip. The descendants of people whose property was seized now use property rights doctrine to prevent returning that property. They've turned the Constitution into a shield for theft, and the Supreme Court's current majority has cited APRA briefs favorably in 4 recent property cases. They're building the legal infrastructure to deny your claim before you file it. The math doesn't lie. In 1860, the total assessed value of enslaved human beings in the American South was $3 billion. That's not 2025 dollars. That's 1860 dollars. Adjusted for inflation alone, that's $96 billion today. But that's just the assessed value, not the labor value. Economic historians at Cornell calculated actual wealth generation. From 1619 to 1865, enslaved labor produced $14 trillion worth of economic output in current values. That's agricultural production, infrastructure construction, domestic service, industrial manufacturing, and reproductive labor. 14 trillion in stolen wages. Now add compound interest at the conservative rate of 3% annually over 160 years. That calculation breaks Excel. The number is $687 trillion. For context, total global GDP is 105 trillion. The unpaid debt to Black Americans is 6.5 times the entire economic output of planet Earth for 1 year. They can't pay it, structurally impossible. The American economy would collapse. The global financial system would destabilize, which means they have exactly two options: national repentance and radical economic restructuring, or legal maneuvering to minimize obligation. They've chosen option 2, and they're using your DNA to do it. Here's where it gets biblical. Revelation 18:13 lists the merchandise of Babylon in its final days: gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet, all manner of vessels, ivory, precious wood, brass, iron, marble, cinnamon, odors, ointments, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, beasts, sheep, horses, chariots. And at the end of the list, the 14th item: slaves and souls of men. Not just slaves, souls. The system doesn't merely trade bodies. It commodifies the spiritual essence, the generational destiny, the covenantal identity of human beings made in God's image. Babylon's final judgment comes not primarily for idolatry, not for sexual immorality, but for the trade in human souls. Verse 20 declares, "Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her." The vengeance is mathematical. Verse 6, "Reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double according to her works. In the cup which she hath filled, fill to her double." Double recompense. Not equal payment. Double. If the debt is 687 trillion in stolen labor, the judgment requires 1,374 trillion. That number doesn't represent God's cruelty. It represents his justice calibrated to the magnitude of the crime. And the principalities administering the American financial system understand this at a level deeper than conscious thought. They know the bill is coming due. They know the system cannot survive payment, so they're trying to negotiate the debt down by controlling who counts as a creditor. Let me show you something they buried. In 1854, a free black man named Solomon Northup published his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. It became a bestseller, was adapted into multiple films, won Academy Awards in 2014. But there's a document connected to Northup that never made the movies. In 1853, after his rescue from slavery, Northup filed a criminal complaint against the men who kidnapped him. The case went to trial. The kidnappers were acquitted. Not because evidence was lacking, because New York law prohibited black people from testifying against whites in criminal proceedings. The trial transcript still exists in the Washington, D.C. Superior Court archives. 63 pages of testimony where Northup's voice is recorded by the court reporter but legally inadmissible. He's present. He's speaking truth. But the system has made his truth irrelevant by declaring his identity insufficient for standing. That's the blueprint they're implementing right now. You'll be present in the verification system. Your ancestors will be in the database. Your claims will be documented. But the standards for what constitutes admissible proof will be written by the descendants of the people who destroyed the original proof. And when 60% of applicants are denied certification, they'll call it objective standards rather than systematic exclusion. Romans 11:9 quotes David's psalm, "Let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense unto them." The feast they spread becomes the thing that captures them. They're building a table of recognition, documentation, acknowledgement. They want you to sit at it. They want you to be grateful for the invitation. They want you to accept their framework as the only legitimate path to restitution. And that table is a trap. Every piece of information you provide feeds the database they'll use to limit your claim. Every DNA test you submit gives them biological markers to narrow the definition of descendant. Every document you upload helps them establish what counts as proof and what doesn't. They're not recording your lineage. They're enclosing it. The date matters more than the name. July 9, 2024. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in Henderson v. City of Detroit that municipal reparations programs must demonstrate particularized harm to specific individuals rather than general community impact. Translation: you can't claim harm from slavery just because you're black. You have to prove your specific ancestor was enslaved in that specific jurisdiction, and that you personally suffered quantifiable damage from that specific ancestor's enslavement. It's a standing requirement that makes most claims impossible. But here's what the ruling actually said in footnote 47. Plaintiffs have not availed themselves of available genealogical verification systems to establish the requisite connection. The court didn't say the verification systems need to exist. It assumed they do, which means when conservative foundations build those systems, courts will require you to use them. They're creating the gate and the law that forces you through it simultaneously. Ezekiel 22:29 describes the pattern. The people of the land have used oppression and exercised robbery and have vexed the poor and needy. Yea, they have oppressed the stranger wrongfully. Verse 30. And I sought for a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found none. God is looking for someone to stand in the gap, not to pray about injustice, to physically interpose themselves between the oppressor and the oppressed, to rebuild the legal and economic hedge that protects the vulnerable. The conservative foundations positioning themselves as lineage defenders are not standing in the gap. They're widening it while claiming to build bridges. Notice who's silent. The NAACP issued a brief statement supporting documentation standards. The National Urban League praised the Lineage Verification Act as a step toward accountability. The Congressional Black Caucus split 17-14 in favor of federal certification requirements. They've been convinced that recognition with conditions is better than continued denial. They don't see that conditions become cages. They don't understand that the people writing the standards are the same people who benefit from most descendants not qualifying. This is the skipped verse. Amos 5:21-24. I despise your feast days, and I will not smell in your solemn assemblies. Though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. God doesn't want religious performance. He wants structural justice. He doesn't want symbolic acknowledgement. He wants wealth returned. He doesn't want verification systems. He wants jubilee. And jubilee doesn't require you to prove you deserve what was stolen. It presumes you do and demands return. The archive tells a different story than the one they're writing. Between 1865 and 1920, there were 183 documented land takings from black communities through legal mechanisms. Not night riders, not lynch mobs, legal instruments, tax reassessments, eminent domain, zoning changes, debt foreclosures. Each one followed proper procedure. Each one had judicial oversight. Each one resulted in black families losing property they'd legally purchased and transferred to white ownership at below market values. The Harvard Property Rights Archive has documented every single case. The total acreage is 4.2 million acres. Current agricultural and development value is $890 billion. None of that is included in standard reparations calculations because the takings were technically legal. But legality and justice are not synonyms. Slavery was legal. Segregation was legal. Redlining was legal. Legal doesn't mean righteous, and a system that makes theft legal doesn't eliminate the debt. It just compounds it. The question before you isn't whether you'll seek recompense. The question is whether you'll let them frame the terms, whether you'll accept their documentation standards or investigate the property rights you already have, whether you'll participate in their verification system or build parallel legal strategies that bypass their gatekeeping, whether you'll wait for their process or force the jubilee they're designed to prevent. They're not defending your lineage. They're defending themselves against what your lineage entitles you to claim. The clock reads 11:47 p.m. on the global financial system, not metaphorically, literally. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank for central banks, published a risk assessment in November 2024 that financial analysts call the 13-minute warning. Their modeling shows that if just 8% of valid historical property claims against American real estate were successfully litigated, the resulting title clouds would freeze $17 trillion in property transactions. Banks couldn't issue mortgages on clouded titles. Real estate couldn't be sold. Property tax revenues would collapse. Municipal bonds would default. The cascading failures would trigger what they're calling the Great Immobilization, the entire property-based wealth system locked in legal paralysis. That's not civil rights activists making demands. That's Swiss bankers calculating exposure. And they've given the American legal establishment until 2027 to contain the liability. That's why the urgency. That's why the sudden conservative embrace of black genealogy. That's why the verification systems appeared overnight. They're not trying to help you claim what's yours. They're trying to prevent you from realizing how much is yours and how fragile their grip on it actually is. Joel 2:25 is the promise. And I will restore to you the years that the locust hath eaten, the cankerworm and the caterpillar and the palmerworm, my great army which I sent among you. 4 types of locusts, 400 years of compounded devouring. But verse 26 continues, and ye shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God that hath dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never be ashamed. Not just survival, satisfaction. Not just compensation, abundance. Not just acknowledgement, wonder. This is restoration language. God doesn't repair, He restores. He doesn't patch, He makes whole. And the mechanism He uses in Joel is precise. He returns what was consumed with increase in a single harvest. The single harvest is coming. Every indicator confirms it. But they're building thrashing floors that separate you from the grain. 3 things happen simultaneously when systems near collapse. First, the enforcers become sympathetic. Second, new management structures emerge that promise reform while preserving essential hierarchies. Third, the people being oppressed are offered symbols of progress that function as containment. We're watching all 3 in real time. Conservative pundits who built careers on colorblind meritocracy now acknowledge historical harm, enforcement sympathy. Bipartisan coalitions form around verification and documentation standards, new management promising reform. Federal databases and certification programs appear with billions in funding, symbolic progress functioning as containment. Here's what the mirror shows. In 1877, Reconstruction collapsed through an almost identical pattern. Northern Republicans who'd enforced civil rights became sympathetic to Southern complaints about federal overreach. Compromise coalitions formed around states' rights and local control. Black Americans were offered sharecropping contracts and tenant farming arrangements as symbols of economic participation. Within 15 years, every gain from emancipation had been administratively reversed without repealing a single constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment stood. The 14th Amendment stood. The 15th Amendment stood. But through sympathetic enforcement, reformed management, and symbolic participation, the substance was gutted while the structure remained. The present reflects that past with technological efficiency. The Lineage Verification Act stands as constitutional protection. The National Registry promises inclusion and recognition. The certification process offers participation in your own documentation, but read the enforcement mechanisms. Section 12 grants qualified immunity to registry administrators for documentation decisions. Section 18 makes registry determinations binding in federal civil suits. Section 23 prohibits class action lawsuits challenging registry standards. They've built legal immunity into the gatekeeping structure. When you're denied certification, you can't sue. When the standards exclude you, you have no recourse. When the database that's supposed to help you becomes the barrier that stops you, You cannot challenge it in court. Galatians 4:29 describes the pattern. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Ishmael persecuted Isaac not before Isaac's birth, but after, not when Isaac was weak, but when Isaac's inheritance became undeniable. The persecution intensifies at the moment the promise becomes tangible. You're not being documented because they've repented. You're being documented because your inheritance is manifesting, and they're attempting to legally partition you from it. The future reflects backward from 2031. That's 6 years from now. The youngest survivors who have living memory of elders born in the 1860s will be gone. The last direct testimonial chain to slavery will be severed. The genealogical work that requires oral history, family stories, cemetery visits with grandmothers who remember will become impossible. And they know this. The Verification Act's proposed implementation timeline is 4 years for database construction, then a 10-year window for certification applications, closing in 2035. After that, documentation standards default to written records only. No oral testimony, no community verification, no family knowledge, just plantation ledgers, auction records, and church registries, documents controlled by descendants of enslavers. They're waiting for the witnesses to die, so the testimony becomes inadmissible. But here's what they didn't calculate. Joel 2:28, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. The prophetic generation doesn't need their verification because the Spirit provides supernatural knowledge. The dreams restore what the documents destroyed. The visions reveal what the archives hid. God is raising up a generation that knows who they are not through paper trails but through divine revelation. And there's no database for that. No certification requirement for spiritual inheritance. No documentation standard for prophetic authority. Let me show you the convergence. In 1991, the United Nations International Law Commission adopted the draft articles on state responsibility. Article 31 requires full reparation for internationally wrongful acts, including restitution, compensation, and satisfaction. Article 35 defines restitution as restoring the situation that existed before the wrongful act. The transatlantic slave trade qualifies as an internationally wrongful act under 12 different international law provisions. The United States is signatory to 7 treaties that incorporate these principles, which means Black Americans don't just have domestic standing. They have international legal personality under treaties the U.S. has ratified. You can file claims with the International Court of Justice. You can petition the UN Human Rights Committee. You can invoke the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which the U.S. ratified in 1994. The conservative foundations know this. That's why Senator Cotton's bill includes Section 29, exclusivity of federal process. It declares that any claim based on historical racial harm must be filed through the National Registry System, and that filing through international mechanisms constitutes waiver of domestic standing. They're trying to prevent you from going over their heads. They're attempting to make their flawed verification system the only legal avenue, blocking international law remedies that don't require their documentation standards. But international law doesn't recognize domestic limitations on fundamental human rights. The ICJ ruled in 2004 that states cannot legislate away obligations under jus cogens norms, peremptory international law principles, including prohibition of slavery and racial discrimination. The U.S. cannot pass a law that makes international reparations claims invalid. They can ignore the claims. They can refuse to comply with rulings. But they cannot eliminate the legal standing, which means you have 2 paths. Their controlled domestic process with impossible standards, or international law mechanisms with established precedent that don't require DNA tests and approved genealogists. Isaiah 43:18 commands, "Remember ye not the former things, neither consider the things of old." Then verse 19, "Behold, I will do a new thing, now it shall spring forth, shall ye not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." God isn't telling you to forget history. He's telling you not to be limited by historical patterns. The old way was petitioning oppressors for justice. The new thing is international legal standing, parallel economic systems, and supernatural revelation of inheritance. The way in the wilderness isn't through their verification system. It's around it. Practical mobilization starts with knowledge. First action, document everything yourself. Record your grandmother's stories. Photograph cemetery headstones. Scan family Bibles. Create your own archive independent of federal databases. Second, join or form genealogical societies that aren't funded by conservative foundations. The Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society operates in 43 states with no government funding. Third, learn the international law mechanisms. The UN Human Rights Committee accepts individual communications. The process is free. The evidentiary standards are different than domestic courts. They accept oral testimony, community verification, and pattern evidence. Fourth action, build parallel economics. Every dollar spent in the system that stole from you funds the structure that prevents return. Black-owned banks hold $87 billion in assets across 42 institutions. Credit unions add another $23 billion. Cooperative ownership models, community land trusts, and mutual aid networks create wealth circulation that doesn't depend on their verification or approval. Fifth, study property law. The Legal Clinic at Howard University offers free training on adverse possession, quiet title actions, and heir property claims. You don't need a law degree to file a quiet title claim on land your great-grandfather owned. You need the deed, the tax records, and the courage to fight. Sixth, use their own tools against them. The National Registry database, if it passes, will be public record under FOIA, which means once they've collected millions of genealogies, you can request the entire dataset and analyze it for patterns they don't want you to see. How many people denied certification? What documentation did they lack? Who made the decisions? FOIA requests cost nothing but time. Seventh, form legal defense funds. The Southern Poverty Law Center model but focused specifically on property rights and reparations claims. Pool resources. Hire lawyers. File systematically. Make it cost them more to fight than to settle. Eighth action, reject the either-or framing. They want you to believe it's their verification system or nothing. That's a lie. You can document through their system while simultaneously pursuing international claims, filing quiet title actions, organizing boycotts of institutions that profited from slavery, and building parallel economies. These aren't competing strategies. They're simultaneous pressure points. Ninth, reclaim the prophetic voice. Stop asking permission from people who benefit from your dispossession. Stop waiting for acknowledgement from systems built on your exploitation. Declare the Jubilee yourself. Proclaim the restoration. Speak the inheritance into manifestation with the same authority Jesus used in Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. The final action is the hardest. Trust the promise more than the process. Joel 2:32 concludes, "And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call." Deliverance doesn't come through their verification. It comes through divine calling. The remnant isn't certified by bureaucrats. It's called by God. Your inheritance doesn't depend on their approval. It depends on his promise. The verdict is already rendered. Obadiah 1:21 declared it, "And saviors shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's." Not might be, shall be. The transfer is certain. The only question is whether you'll wait for their timeline or operate on God's, whether you'll submit to their standards or stand on his word, whether you'll accept their limited restoration or claim the fullness Joel promised. They're building a system to control who inherits, but inheritance doesn't flow through systems. It flows through bloodlines, and your blood carries promises they cannot legislate away, debts they cannot administratively dismiss, and authority they cannot certify or deny. You are not waiting for recognition. You are the recognition. You are not hopping for restoration. You are the restoration. You are not petitioning for inheritance. You are the inheritance manifesting. The conservative defense of black lineage is their last attempt at containment before the full transfer they know is coming. They're not helping you remember who you are. They're trying to limit what that identity entitles you to claim. They're not defending your heritage. They're defending their holdings against your heritage. But the years the locust ate are being restored. The wealth stolen across 4 centuries is returning. The land taken through fraud is being reclaimed. The inheritance delayed is manifesting. And no verification system, no documentation standard, no federal database can stop what God has already set in motion. The kingdom is the Lord's. The possession returns to the possessed. The saviors are rising on Zion, not petitioners, not victims, not applicants hopping for certification. Saviors, judges, inheritors taking what was always theirs by divine right and covenant promise. They can build their gates, but they cannot stop the flood.
Welcome to the channel Story.